Hey, listeners, before we get into today's episode, I just want to thank our sponsors, and we got two sponsors today. The first of which is Kind Bar. Kind is deeply committed to crafting food with real, recognizable ingredients, a disruptive notion that sparked the creation of a new, healthy snacking category. Kind is unapologetic in their efforts to challenge the status quo, to shift the food industry, and empower the community and our listeners to make better, informed choices about health. Kindness can be a transformative force for good, and that is why we are teaming up with Kind to bring our listeners 10% or 15% off for military teachers, students, first responders, doctors, and nurses. Go to podgo.co/kind. That's podgo.co/kind. Kind Bar, creating a kinder and healthier world, one act, one snack at a time. Our second sponsor for today is returning sponsor Pretentious Pickle. The Pretentious Pickle Company is located here in Plymouth, Massachusetts at 190 Water Street, and they have a wide variety of pickled items, everything from pickled cucumbers to mushrooms, Brussels sprouts, asparagus, carrots, beets, anything that you can pickle, they pickle. And it's a delicious snack, and if you're in a pickle for what to get your significant other for Valentine's Day, just go to Pretentious Pickle and they can sort that out for you. You can, again, find them at 190 Water Street here in Plymouth, or find them on the web at pretentiouspickle.com. And now let's get into our show. Welcome back, Inebri-ites. This is Andy, the Inebri-art podcast. And today joining us is Brian Naslund, author. Welcome to the show, man.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So what styles of books do you tend to write mostly?
Sure. So yeah, I have two books out, and they're both adult fantasy, and they're both part of the same series, which is called Dragons of Terra. So it's, if you're like not super into fantasy, it's kind of like Game of Thrones. I would say there's less incest and more dragons. And then if you're more familiar with fantasy, it's kind of in the same vein as a guy who I like called Joe Abercrombie. So, it's sort of, people call it gritty fantasy, which I think is sort of a silly term, but it does work fairly well. It's, if it was a movie, it would be rated R. It talks about people's, sort of lower level concerns as they're going through these fantasy worlds, that kind of thing.
So what is it about fantasy do you think that piques your interest? Like, is it, or is that just happen to be what you first started writing about?
No, I didn't start writing it. Well, I should say that, I was always a big reader, but I didn't read a lot of fantasy as a kid. I just played a ton of video games. So like the injection of fantasy elements was all coming from there, and, fantasy movies or whatever. But in college, I was an English major, and I always liked writing, and I took a lot of creative writing classes and enjoyed that stuff. But you do like postmodern short stories for the most part in academic classes. So it's like, I was writing like Raymond Carver knockoffs and stuff like that. And they weren't very good. I enjoyed writing, but I didn't think that that wasn't really the type of thing that I was in love with or anything like that. I was just kind of following the crowd. And then after I graduated, I realized that no one's like grading me anymore. No one's going to give me shit if I write a story about a hungover dragon slayer instead. So that's what I did. And that was actually I wrote it kind of on a whim a few days after I graduated. And those like initial pages became the first chapter of Blood of an Exile, which was the first book.
Was it an idea that you had been like kind of kicking around for a long time, or was there like a sudden spark once you were done with school?
Yeah, no, I made it up kind of on the spot, and it was really that premise. I can't remember if it's the day after I graduated or a couple days after. Either way, I was kind of hungover.
I was going to say, was the hangover because of graduation?
Yeah, it was like coming out of my life. And I wasn't like, I didn't have the symbol of like, I'm now going to have to slay life or anything like that. Like, I'm not that deep with things, but I was like, screw it. Like, I'm not going to write another short story about a guy who's like, doesn't like his job and his wife and has this internal conflict. I'm going to do something that I haven't done before. And so it's just like, he's hungover, he has to kill a dragon. That's like all I have basically. And then I wrote Yeah, the pages that wound up in the first chapter, like I wrote a lot of them that day, but I didn't continue after that. I sort of, I went to deal with my hangover and moved on with other things or whatever. And it wasn't until years later that I kind of started it again, trying to actually write a book out of it. And that was when, because it had sort of been sitting there. I hadn't been thinking about it too much, but at least like when I came back to it, I was like, oh yeah, I remember he like has to kill the dragon. He's hungover. It was meant to be like if dragons were real and you had to kill them, like how would you actually do it? It was supposed to be like realistic except for the dragon. And I was like, yeah, I remember that. And from there I started, thinking of what might be like a full book or a full story. And the thing kind of sprawled. And I do like a huge amount of rewriting and reworking. So I try to outline, but I fail at it every time. So the whole thing is very kind of a messy, like reductive process. I don't know if reductive is the right term. I rewrite over and over again to get these things done.
So how many times do you think you rewrite, or do you kind of like rewrite a few pages at a time, or do you finish the story and then go back and rewrite the whole thing?
It's like kind of a mixture. I know. So with the first one, I wrote it on. I used to have a really long bus ride to work, so I would just work on it. The bus ride could be like 45 minutes to 2 hours, depending on weather and traffic. So really, over the course of like 5 or 6 years, I was kind of picking away at it. So I didn't really care if I threw a scene out that I'd written the day before. Like I was kind of just killing time, and then eventually I had to rewrite. So I didn't pay as much attention for that one. But with the second one, I moved kind of like the way I was writing to a program called Scrivener that shows you like your word counts and all of that. So I know for a fact the book clocked in at like 152,000 words, but I wrote like 380,000 words. So it's just sort of a constant process of like rewriting and redoing. And it's usually not like, draft from start to finish and then do it over again. It's like, this wasn't a good plot line, so I have to change it. But I do a lot of stuff with interweaving plot lines. So if you change one, you break everything else. And it's this like Jenga tower nightmare of getting everything to fit together and also be good. So there are writers that I've heard of who just like outline for a month, write for 2 months, and their book is done. And that's unfortunately not the way that I'm doing things right now.
I feel like I don't know. Like when COVID hit, I had like a real creative block, and at one point I'm always kicking around story ideas in my head, and I'm like, I'm going to try to write one of these down. And I got a little ways in, but I found that if I didn't have like an actor kind of in my head for that character, like, okay, this character is going to be this person, I had trouble kind of like voicing the character. Do you kind of like do that same thing where you try to think of a person, either whether it's someone you know or someone famous, to kind of give your character a voice?
It's interesting. I don't think I ever did. I never pictured an actor. Like when the book was coming out, people would ask, and I said Tom Hardy would be a good guy for the main guy, and then I realized afterwards that pretty much everyone, they have like a male kind of like fantasy character who like commits active lives. Everyone says Tom Hardy because I feel like he's both like versatile and like, I don't know, he can just do a whole lot of things. Like he can fit like a lot of different roles. But anyway, no, I don't really picture a person. I do though, like rewrite dialogue and stuff the most. Like of the things that I rewrite, I mess around with dialogue all the time. And I don't necessarily like read it out loud, but I do think in my head, I kind of try to like truly like visualize the scene. But yeah, I never thought of it. I visualize scenes a lot and kind of like try to have a conversation in my head, but there's no like people attached to them. They're just kind of blank. And then now the covers have people on them. So they've kind of like, in my head, I picture the people that are on the covers.
Do you, when you're writing the dialogue, do you try to make it conversational, or, it's like you see movies all the time and, everyone loves Bruce Willis saying "yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker," but you'd never say that in real life. So do you try to like write heroically or kind of like casually? Like how do you kind of walk that line so it's not sounding ridiculous either?
Yeah, I try to keep it casual, and I write, I guess, this is not at all unique these days, but in the style where people kind of talk the way you would talk normally. Like today, there's not a lot of affectation of like fantasy type language, if you want to call it that. And I did that. I was kind of copying other fantasy writers that I was sort of like being exposed to who tend to do it that way. And then I always figured that even if they're talking in this very ornate like language, like, form of Elvish or whatever from Lord of the Rings, to the people speaking it feels casual, even if it's actually really formal because it's like what they're used to. So I always figured I'd just like do kind of a universal translator where everyone is being pretty informal. And like I spend probably more time than some people like just having characters just like bullshitting around a campfire and, just shooting the shit kind of.
Yeah, I feel like a interesting example of that is like Thor in the Marvel universe. Is when they first rolled him out, he was very, as Guardian, and then by the time you get to Ragnarok, he's just he talks a little different, but not much, and it really, I feel like his character got way more interesting because I felt like he was more relatable.
Oh yeah, Thor is so interesting because I've never I didn't even care enough about the first Thor movie to dislike it. I was just like, there's nothing here for me.
Yeah.
That I think is particularly interesting. And then I feel like I don't think I watched the second one of like his standalone thing. So I think he when he came back around in Avengers when I saw him again, and I think even in the Avengers movies, he progressively got like more and more interesting. And then all of a sudden he's like, I don't know who my favorite Avengers character is, but he's like definitely one of the most enjoyable ones, especially as like went along. And I feel like they found his voice, his look. He looked so weird in the first movie, and
like if you go back at the time, you're like, oh my god, that's exactly what Thor looks like, and then 10 years later, you're like, oh, he looks ridiculous.
Yeah, and I feel like I think Ragnarok was my favorite one, and I think I watched that one with my partner, and she was like, that was so great, like let's go back and watch the other ones. I'm like, I don't think that's a good idea, but let's try it. And we made it in like 15 minutes. They were like, no, never mind. Ragnarok is what we stick with.
So is writing now your full-time gig, or is this still kind of a on the bus thing?
It's not full-time. I have a full-time day job in tech. So I wind up kind of doing full-time hours for both. I write for about like 30 or 35 hours a week. And then
it's still pretty significant.
Yeah. And then the day job, it's usually at least the same. And then sometimes there's periods where the day job is like 80 hours a week if there's a problem or like a project that we really need to get done. So, still doing the day job for now anyway.
And with the lockdown, are you struggling to write? Are you finding it easier to write because you have more time to kind of sit at home and do nothing? Or, how's it affected you creatively?
Yeah, it definitely hasn't made me more productive. I feel like there are very few people who are like, yeah, lockdown is an awesome time to feel super.
And they're super weird people, man. Like I know a few people like, I like it. And I'm like, you're strange.
Yeah. I don't think it's made me less. I mean, it hasn't changed my life that much because I had the bus, the job with the long bus commute, but I've switched since then. So I work from home anyway. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of had like a slightly hermit-like life locked in anyway, because I spend so much time writing my book. So it's kind of like I write in the morning, kind of switch to the day job and do sort of like text, like, I don't know, more analytical number type shit. And then I move back to writing in the afternoon. And I've been doing that for 3 years now, two or 3 years. So the only thing from what my creative process, it didn't really get changed at all. The main thing that changed is that I would usually go to like a bar down the street in the afternoon and like drink a beer and do my writing there. Mm-hmm. And I can't do that obviously anymore. So I move locations in my house and kind of like, all right, now we're back to the writing side and save money because I'm drinking beer that I bought at the liquor store and all that.
It's surprising how much that saves because
it's enough for me to notice, and like I sort of like have like a loose budget, and suddenly there's like extra money around, and I was like, wait, why is this happening? It's like, oh yeah, that was kind of expensive.
Is there a trick to kind of like switching in and out of, because it's not just work and creativity, it sounds like your job's pretty technical, so is it hard to switch kind of from that creative out of the box thinking into something that's very analytical and then back out again?
I think it's like it's nice that they're different. Like, and I used to, my tech kind of career has originally I was it's called like content marketing, but I was basically like a writer. I'd write blog posts and stuff like that. And mm-hmm. slowly over the course of time, I moved to a role where I don't do any writing for the technical side anyway. I don't code or design, so I like still am the soft skill guy in the room. But yeah, it's doesn't kind of. I always feel like it's weird to say like flexing the writing muscle, but like it doesn't drain kind of the writing side of things, and vice versa. Like writing for a few hours in the morning doesn't, like, I don't feel drained to go kind of look at a website and talk to an engineer and kind of like do that work. So they work pretty well together, actually. The only times that it's really like a conflict is when one or the other is aggressively stressful for whatever reason, and then it's less that like I had to switch gears and more that I'm just like stressed out and worried, and like it's hard to do anything when you're in a stressed out headspace. And I'm prone to like that kind of like anxiety and stuff like that. So it's more about trying to just like manage time and keep calm and all that stuff. But yeah, generally speaking, the jobs are different enough to not really like conflict with each other.
So do you try to set, like, I don't know what the writing cadence or anything is, but when you have your book, do you try to set hard deadlines for a certain amount written by a certain time, or is that too stressful and kind of gets in the way?
Yeah, no, I like waffle with it, and it's funny because the first one I wrote it, like I said, over the course of many years, like leisurely, like didn't really pay attention to anything besides like whether the bus had arrived at my stop, I didn't care how much I got done or how little I got done. But once the deal goes through, so for fantasy and for like adult fantasy like this, they kind of want you to do a book a year.
Mm-hmm.
And so these deadlines come in very fast. And, we've been shopping around the book with my agent for a while. And she's like, don't write the second book because if this doesn't get sold, you've written the sequel. Like that goes nowhere. Like it's a waste of time. And then all of a sudden the deal goes through and like, okay, so we need the book in like, like basically a year. You need to turn the next one around. And so my daily word count goal has increased as I've realized how much I rewrite things.
Yeah.
So I think I was like, I'll do like 500 words a day. And if I can get to 750, I'll stop and, kind of keep it fresh or whatever. And now it depends. When I'm in kind of like a big drafting mode where I don't really care too much about whether it's good or bad, it's like 1,500 to 2,000 words a day. And then when it's like a little bit more granular and rewrites, it's like 1,000 words a day. And if I can get more, great. And then now I'm actually in like an editing spot where I don't really care about word count. I try to say like, I'm going to get through like just this scene or as much as I can of this scene today. And kind of structure it that way. See, I think structure helps me particularly because my process is so like wasteful. If I don't structure it, I'll like never get it finished in time.
So you have 2 out already. Is this other book you're working on? Is this in the same series?
Yeah. So this will be the third one in the trilogy, and kind of the last one, at least, of this sort of like character arc thing. And it was a 3-book deal, so the future becomes like a little bit uncertain. You sort of like see what comes after that. But yeah, this is the third one, and the publishing is funny because like it works on these long timelines. So the second one came out earlier in August, but I've been done with it for like 9 months, so it almost feels like I forget that it's. I don't forget that the book isn't out, but I forget sometimes that parts of storylines like people don't know about yet, and people will like tweet at me, and I'm like, I could have sworn that was in the first book, which is why I sometimes will accidentally spoil things because I just forget what's like out and what's not. But yeah, so I'm due to get my edits from my editor pretty soon here for the third one, and then I'll kind of toil away on that for hopefully a few weeks versus a few months, but we'll see, and then that'll basically lock up the trilogy for me.
Now, let me just kind of ask you. So the thing that jumps to mind immediately is The Matrix, because I love the first Matrix movies. The second 2 are horrible. It's just like this wasn't a trilogy initially, and then like they ham-fisted made it into a trilogy. Were you like really cognizant about that? Did you kind of have the whole thing kind of set and maybe not outline, but did you have like a end point that you're trying to get to the entire time, and are you leaving it open for future more novels and side stories and whatever?
Yeah, I'd say I did. The first book, I wanted to be written to a sense where like if there was no second or third, it could still be enjoyable, and there's like some level of like closure and all of that. But at the same time, it is like a very connected story. And I had a plan, not really for like, this is what happens in book 2 and this is what happens in book 3, but I had a plan for like how the thing was going to end for these characters, like this arc of their lives or whatever was going to end. The funny thing was though, that I didn't really, like it was a very rough outline, and I didn't work on it, as sort of I was working on the first book over and over and over again. I did lots of edits with my agent and lots of edits with my editor. So by the time it came time to write it, like enough had changed where I was like, I didn't completely change my mind, but a lot of like ideas that I'd had about where it would go kind of weren't relevant anymore. Or I'd come up with sort of better directions that I wanted to move in. So it was still a very painful process to write the second book. It's funny because it was about this time last year when I was doing the edits for the second one, and I came pretty close to having a nervous breakdown. It really wasn't going very well at certain points, but eventually it kind of all clicked together and got to a place where I was super happy with it. And like the pieces of the story that I knew I wanted were like fully clicked in with the new things that I kind of come up with that hadn't been fully expected. So
was it painful?
There was, oh God.
Sorry, was it painful because you had to cut out parts, or do you just not enjoy editing, or like what's?
No, I like it. It was more that it was just so much of like, it's like I need to change this part of this draft, but it's going to break. Every plot line is going to be broken now, and I have to come up with a way that it will fit together. And the best way I can do that is like some people could probably just sit in a room and think, but I'm like, all right, so I'm just going to write. I'm going to write the fix for this plot line. I'm going to see if it works in this plot line over here, and then I'm going to see if it works over here. And probably, I would like to think, I guess we'll find out. I'll email you in a few months and tell you whether I had a nervous breakdown the third time around. Maybe I'll be like a little bit better at it. But yeah, it's more like not, and I was willing, I guess, to like put the time in. If I thought something was fine but wasn't as good as I could possibly get it, then I would just redo it. And that approach was like pretty painstaking. But there were definitely, I think, like drafts that were kind of Matrix 2 level unsatisfying for both me and I assume if anyone had ever read them, the readers and all that. But I like to think that those are all now just gone and the product turned out okay.
I feel like one of the things that irritates me about like modern entertainment is the hyper analysis, like looking for plot holes. And I mean, sometimes I find them quirky and interesting. Like I remember someone said the gunners at the beginning of Star Wars, if they had just shot down the escape pod that they thought was empty, the story would have been over. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. But then there's people that will just nitpick every little point of a story. Is that something that you worry about, or are there plot holes where you're like, that's just such a small plot hole, I'm not going to worry about it?
Yeah, it's definitely on my mind, especially during the editorial phase. And I feel like my editor is really good at kind of pointing out one thing where it's like, would this character really do it this way, where he do it a different way? And I'm like, well, he do it the way that you're saying, obviously, and I have to rewrite this now, but now I have to go back and redo all this stuff. But he's good at finding the ones that matter. And then sometimes I'll get into a phase where it's like, all right, well, if I screwed that up, then like, what are those other 900 things that like, is this really how it would go down? And you can drive yourself insane. And that's part of the whole terrible summer that I went through myself. And a lot of times it was fine, or like the adjustment was so easy. Like I didn't need to rewrite the whole premise of whatever like was kind of a plot hole. You just need to adjust it a little bit and the plot hole's gone or filled in enough. So I do some of that. I think that I have gotten better at, not like freaking out and just like thinking about what's a solution that's logical, that's going to just tighten up whatever's going on. And then some I just ignore, because one thing I feel like what I've learned the hard way too is that if you try to fill every plot hole, your story's kind of boring. At least that's been my experience. I'm sure some people have 0 plot holes in their work, but my stuff is epic fantasy. It's like pretty complicated and sprawling, and I let some of them go.
Yeah. What's the appeal with dragons? I mean, I feel, and I'm a dragon fan. I play Dungeons and Dragons. Some of my favorite movies have dragons in them. But what is it through history that have brought me, you, and everybody else to want dragon stories? And they always vary so much, so it's not even like sometimes they're mindless, sometimes they're intelligent, sometimes they can talk, sometimes they can cast spells. So why dragons?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I feel like I feel like I have an unsatisfying answer given how prevalent dragons are in my books. Because I think I came from it. When I first had that like kernel of an idea, I was just picking like the tropiest fantasy thing. I was like, I want to do something weird. Dragon Slayer, and I thought of the Dragon Slayer before the dragons. Like, all right, well, if they're going to be, if he's got to go kill a dragon, so they're here now. And then I tried to make my dragons as realistic as you can make them, besides the fact that they're like a mythical creature. So they're just big apex predators. They're big animals, and they're everywhere. And there's all these different types, and they impact their environment and places where they get overhunted. It causes all sorts of other issues. Even though like the fact that dragons are gone is in theory a good thing. So my dragons are way, way more kind of just inspired by like real animals, and trying to like think of what a real animal like would do if it was that big. In terms of like why dragons are so appealing in general, it's funny because I don't have a clear reason why, but they're just, I've always loved them. They're just cool. I feel like even from when I was like playing Magic the Gathering with my brother as a kid, like the dragon cards were always the ones that I liked most. And even if they like, I was terrible at that game and little, so I always lost. But even when I like shouldn't be playing the dragon cards, I would play them anyway, just because like I liked them and thought they were awesome. I don't know.
That's one of those games that I never got into. I've played it a few times, but I always felt the more money you spend, the more likely it is you win, and that just kind of made it less interesting for me.
Yeah, and I didn't stick with it. I remember like I couldn't like tell you like a rule or anything like that that I like that I like used with it. But I remember like the little mana like pouch thingies, and I like those too. I don't know, I feel like I was missing the point of the game in some ways, where I like to like read the cards over and over again and look at them. But yeah, I never really got into like playing it like later in life or anything like that.
Yeah. Were there other entertainment type things that interested you in high fantasy, like movies, and like what were the initial spark that caught you as a kid?
Yeah, I feel like my brother was definitely like the gateway person into it, and it's like I was saying, it was through video games. And I think that the first one I really got into was I think I watched him play Final Fantasy VII, or no, I watched him play Final Fantasy VI, and that's kind of like a steampunky fantasy thing. And I was little, like I had to have him like explain the characters to me and all that, and I would like ask him annoying questions about things that he didn't know the answer to, and he was just trying to play the game. But I really like.
Shut up! I just want to play.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, but how does he have the flying castle? Stuff like that. And then Final Fantasy VII was the first one that I was like old enough to play myself. I love that game, and I feel like it occupies like a larger space in my childhood than it should, just because so many hours were spent playing it. Like I feel like when you're that age, I can't remember how old I was exactly, but it's when like it's like the first of everything. So like memories are getting like imprinted, and they don't go away as readily as like now I'll play a game a week ago that I can't remember a single scene from it. It's just like gone from my head. But that game really imprinted just this like swords and dragons and summoning and spells. I found it really appealing. And then as I got a little bit older, I also spent way too much time playing Morrowind, the Elder Scrolls game. I don't know if you ever played that one.
I don't know that one.
It was like the one, Skyrim was the one after that. No, two after that one, but Morrowind was kind of the first one. It's like a big, like, sprawling open world game where, again, you can just kind of like run around and do spells. You can do whatever you want. And I remember I have a very specific memory of that too, where my brother had bought it for me early for us or whatever. And he was like, this is like, it got like an award, so like you should play it. And then he played it for a little while. I was like, never mind, this is not for me. And then so I sort of like took over, and you're like walking through this field, and a guy from nowhere just drops out of the sky. He's naked except for some boots, and he dies. And this was a long time ago, so the idea of that happening just was very surprising to me. Like that you're in this big open world, and the dude just drops out of the sky and he's dead. And he has a note that says something, and then you can put on his shoes, and he like has some enchanted shoes, and if you jump, you'll just go shooting off into the sky and you'll die too. And I remember like just thinking that was so cool. And it's one of those things that like you can't ever go back. I was probably like 12 or 13, I'm thinking, when I played that, maybe a little bit younger or older. And I could never like go back and have a moment like that again in my life. Or like maybe I can, but I don't. I think it's way harder the older you get.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of have those eye-opening moments because we've seen so much more,
Mm-hmm.
But you're making me think about like like the effects of family on kind of our interests. And so I was just kind of like in my mind reminiscing. My mother's side of the family was from Philadelphia, and we used to go down once a year. And literally the thing that got me into comics and fantasy and stuff like that was one of those trips. And it was my cousin had a bunch of comic books and Shogun Warriors and all this cool stuff. And he wouldn't let me, like, oh, you can't touch that. Oh, you can't read that. And it was just like that. Him saying that I couldn't just made me want to be involved in it more. And so, then coming home, found a comic book shop, and that's what got me.
I think
turned me into a giant nerd.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I feel like it's funny how much influence, like the older brother, the older cousin, or sister, whoever it is, has over like what you get into at that age. There's like a remarkable amount of power for a person who's oftentimes not that much older than you.
Yeah, like in my memory, he was like 10 years older. In reality, he's probably more like 3.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it's daunting to like look at what would have happened if like if like another thing had been brought to me instead of kind of like video games, this kind of thing. Like, would I be a different person, or like would you be a different person? I'm not that philosophical, so we have to go down that chain. But it is kind of weird to think
about. So where do you find inspiration for your stories? Do you kind of interpret your day-to-day life? Are you like big into history? Like where do the stories come from?
Yeah, I feel like, I guess it's funny. I don't really have I never have like an ready answer for that. So I feel like I say something different every time, and maybe it's like, I don't know. But I feel like right now, especially as the second and third books have gone on, it's really, I try, even though it's big sprawling fantasy, for it to be pretty character focused and driven. Like, so most of it's about either trying to like put as many people together who disagree with each other in an interesting way as possible, or torture characters relentlessly by just putting, barriers that are fun and interesting to me in front of them. And then the other big, I love reading about just like animal facts on Wikipedia and things like that. And so I feel like, I call it like a low-key addiction. And like the thing that I'll do when I'm stuck with writing or whatever is just get on Wikipedia and go down like big rabbit holes. And rabbit holes of all kinds are interesting to me, but just reading about like the cool shit that animals can do is always really, really fun and inspiring. And because of the way that I've kind of set this world up to be like realistic-ish, but the place where I can really get fantastical and creative is around animals, because there's the one animal that doesn't exist, and that I feel like it kind of gave me leeway to like play with that more. And so I can read like a fun thing about animals and be like, all right, that's kind of cool, but I'm gonna like take it in like another direction that's not like part of the real world, but I think will be fun to do. So yeah, like character driven stuff and just weird stuff about animals.
So do you try to base your dragons as close to real animals as possible? Like, do they breathe fire?
They don't breathe fire. I feel like if you dig deep down into, so they're cold-blooded reptiles. They're sort of like, they're like a dinosaur would be the closest thing to what they are. I mean, I don't base them off of real dinosaurs. I base them more off of like stuff that birds do, but they're meant to be reptiles and have, issues with that reptiles would have. So they're cold-blooded. So like when that opening scene, when the guy goes to kill him, the dragon, he wants to go really early in the morning because they'll be like cold and sluggish and that kind of thing.
Right.
And I feel like, generally try to keep that level of things. So no fire breathing, no like guarding treasure. They're like, they're migratory and they have different mating habits depending on where they are and eat different things. If you went all the way down through it, I don't think there are probably some, that's not fully sewn up. Like there's probably some issues with cold-bloodedness or whatever that, wouldn't hold up. But my argument then would be that they're still not real. So it's fine.
It's funny is we think of like, oh, fire breathing, that's not realistic, but like we have eels that discharge electricity and bioluminescence, and we have venom spraying animals. So it may not be that far off of real life.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's very true. It's funny you mentioned that actually, because the eel electricity thing is something that I kind of grabbed and put into a dragon, and then it also comes up as sort of a a different element of the story that's closer to like what you would think of as magic. And yeah, maybe my imagination doesn't go far enough, but I did it because like it's really interesting the way those things work. And there's a thing, don't like quote me on this, but I think there's like two lobes in an eel, and it's called like a hunter-killer nerve or something like that. That might be what I decided to call it in my head because it sounds really cool. It has kind of a badass name in reality though. And I remember like, this is one of the cool things too, just about the world in general. It's like everyone kind of knows about electrical eels, and you know, you've seen them in cartoons as a kid. It's this like thing that's a given as you're growing up a little bit. But that's insane that an eel can generate electricity, and that's how it's like evolved to like get prey and stuff like that. Like in the abstract, that if electrical eels weren't real, and you put them in a fantasy story, it'd be like, that's a crazy fantasy.
Yeah, that's stupid.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so many things like that with animals. And I had this massive list of things I wanted to incorporate that I'm like, 10% of the way through it is actually in the book. The rest of it is just like crap I thought was interesting and wrote down. I was like, you could do this and that and that. And then it's just going to sit in a folder in my computer forever.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of like science and history, and I listen to tons of podcasts of, stuff you missed in history class, and all sorts of weird things. And I think one of my favorite animal things is that is it the wombat? I think it's a wombat that it poops squares.
I think that is a wombat. Yeah, it like makes
it's like that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I don't know why, but I'm sure that there's some crazy reason that like it actually is like there's some advantage for it to poop squares, or like it's happening because of some other thing that gives an advantage, and that stuff's just wild to me. And the amount of time I've wasted on the internet reading about animals is large.
do you continually like bore your partner with like fun facts about animals? Be like, hey, guess what I read? Yeah,
definitely. Like my partner, my friends, they all hear more about animals than they really want to. But I both can't stop and don't feel like stopping, so it's the perfect storm.
There's worse things, and I just find it funny because like I said, I'm a huge trivia fan, and it's I relate it to people who are super into sports. Because you start talking about sports with people, and they'll be like, "Oh, well, so-and-so in 1977 pitched this," and you're like, "Who cares, man? Let me tell you about Wombat Poop."
Yeah, no, exactly. I had a roommate in college. My roommate freshman year was really, really into animals and fish in particular. And there wasn't a fish in the world that he didn't know. Most of them he'd like seen. He was a big diver, and I remember like when we first showed up, I can't remember if he had fish tanks with him or like early on he was like getting them and bringing them to the dorm, and I was like, what? Like I'm not a fish person to this day, but at this point I was like, what is the point of like all this effort to just have like a fish young around in the tank? And then by the end of the year, when we didn't have anything to do, I just asked him about fish. Like, tell me something cool about a fish that you haven't told me about yet. And he just had all this information. It's so cool.
Do you plan on adding more animals to your novels that, I don't know, not dragons, but, griffins or harpies or...
Oh, got you. Not in this series, probably. It's an interesting question, but yeah, I feel like and part of it, this is a funny thing about, I feel like any kind of creativity where like once you establish a rule in your head that's completely arbitrary that you made up, like you tend to not break it, but forget that it's a thing that can be changed. But yeah, it's just, there are lots of animals in the book. There's a donkey that's with the dragon slayer around who was a lot of fun to write. But yeah, in terms of like other fantastical creatures, I probably wouldn't do it in this one just because I've been following my rules this long. But if I do like other stuff, I might want to try more.
I was just wondering if like you discovered like a new animal tidbit that you're just like, I'm gonna shelf that one and save that one for next book or something.
I had an idea of this. It'd be more of like a space fantasy thing, but where there's like a ton of different animals and creatures. And I thought of it, I have like no concrete thing beyond that. And the idea that I can just go through this massive folder and be like, all right, this is this creature, this is that creature, this is this one, and sort of like, mine all the things that I've collected, but we'll see.
Do you know when you're in the editing process for book 3? Is there like a date that we can expect to see that out?
It's not firmed up yet. I mean, the way things go, it'll probably be around this time ish next year. But things are always kind of subject to change. But that's about what we're shooting for and what I'm on pace for too.
And it's COVID, so who knows?
Yeah, exactly. So that like everything, especially book publishing is there's physical books and there's production and printing and all kinds of things that are tricky, and recording audiobooks was really difficult for a while. So everything's a little bit crazy and up in the air. But
when they do that, are you reading them?
No, they get a voice actor. It was cool too. They kind of brought me a few different people who would read a little sample, and I got to pick the guy who did it. The guy who reads mine, his name is Stephen Brand, and he's awesome and does a fantastic job. He's British, so he makes me sound smarter than I am. And he's really great. It's a weird thing to listen to your own book read aloud by someone else in like an audio file. It's kind of like an uncanny valley experience, but it's still really fun, and he does an awesome job.
Was that kind of like or what, I should say, that's probably a better question. What's been like the weirdest thing about the whole, was it just seeing your first book? Was it having it turned into an audiobook or a signing or?
The audiobook listening was weird. And I think the other kind of crazy thing was like early on when my editor kind of first, we got in touch and, the deal had gone through and he started giving me feedback, and he had like picked up a reference that I'd written like 7 years ago and totally forgotten about. But I was like, yeah, no, that's the point. It's like a little like in joke or something like that. And then every once in a while I'll get emails from people too that have, they reference something else that I kind of did very deliberately, but have sort of forgotten about since. And it's wild that it's like out there when, I've, especially the first one, I was kind of just writing on the bus to kill time and never thought that, anyone would read it really. So that's been really cool.
I feel like that's the show notes for this podcast, because we're recording so far in advance that when the editor puts them together, there'll be like some reference to something I said or someone said, and be like, I don't even know what the hell that means. I'll have to go back and listen. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, you do these like once a week, right? It seems like you're doing it.
They go up once a week, and so right now I think the ones we're recording are due out like November.
Gotcha.
So, a lot of free time, so
it makes sense. And everyone's at home, right? Knowing like, I've got a lot going on and running all around. It's not really the way things are going.
Yeah, it's a little bit different now. But when COVID first hit, we were getting just some crazy guests that I would never expected to get, because people are just sitting around. I mean, you said you listened to the Doc Hammer episode.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I just recorded last week with Amber Nash, who's a voice on Archer.
Gotcha.
And it's just these people are bored, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, everyone's got time on their hands, and like this is like a nice way. I feel like I haven't talked to someone that I haven't met before in months, probably. So it's just like it's a nice thing to have.
Yeah, it's almost like going down to the pub and getting a beer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So is there a specific style of beer that is most conducive to fantasy writing? IPAs, ale, stouts?
Yeah, I'm the cliche just person in the world these days. I feel like like IPAs, and Colorado has also like everywhere else in the world has a lot of like good craft breweries. So Four Noses does an IPA called About Damn Time, and I've basically been drinking that while writing at least half of these books. So.
And you said you're in Colorado?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think Portland is like has one of the top. I'm sorry, not Portland, Boulder. I can't remember. There's a town in Colorado that I think has the highest per capita number of breweries in it.
Yeah, I think it is Boulder. I used to live in Boulder. I live now kind of between Boulder and Denver, but I think, I'm not sure if this is true or just something someone told me, but I think you didn't need a liquor license to sell your beer on premise. And I'm not sure if that's unique anymore, but it used to be. So you could kind of start a brewery and not have to do all that red tape. And so I think that led to like a lot of them in this area, because people would come specifically to do it. Again, I'm just now saying information that could be wildly inaccurate. I just heard someone say that once. I was like, oh,
Yeah,
that makes sense.
but this
But
is going to go up on the internet, so that's what the internet's for.
Exactly right. Now it'll be true because like I'll have hit the like apex limit of whether that's even accurate or not. And I'm sure you'll get emails and people being like, that was just flagrantly false information. But
I'll forward them to you.
Yeah, I'll respond. And then I gave the caveat. I don't know if it's true, but it lines up. And there are breweries everywhere here. It's like, all over the place. Yeah.
So Brian, where can people go to find your book or more information?
Sure. So for more information on me, they can go to my website, which is just briannaslund.com. And then Blood of an Exile and Sorcery of a Queen are available wherever good books are sold. And if you're going to get it, I would encourage you now to get it from a local bookstore, which might be slow and kind of a hassle, but they're like so many businesses not, having a fantastic time here. But, most local stores should have it, and it'd be awesome to pick it up from there if people can.
All right, man. It was great. Sorry that I have such a hard out today, but when your next book comes out and we'll schedule time, we'll have a virtual beer and talk about the new book.
Yeah, it'd be fun. This is a lot of fun, and I'll let you know if I have a nervous breakdown between now and I finish the third one.
So, listeners, you heard it. Brian Naslund claimed that his book is the most popular amongst breweries. That's a fact. And for more, made up facts, we'll catch you guys again next week with another guest. And thanks for listening.
There we go. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. You can find us on all social medias at Inebri-art or on Instagram at Inebri-art6. You can email us at Inebri-art@yahoo.com. And make sure you listen to the other podcasts on the Inebri-art Podcast Network, including Bar Talk, Old Colony Cast, Retro Redoctopus, America's Hometown Horror Podcast, and our newest one, Theme Park Legends, a podcast about working at theme parks. What else? And we'll catch you again next time.